Two titans of Hollywood, standing face to face on a scorching desert set in 1966, the air between them thick with tension that had nothing to do with the cameras rolling. One man, Burt Lancaster, a perfectionist whose athletic body housed an iron will and a temper that could explode like dynamite. The other, Lee Marvin, a war hero turned actor whose demons from the battlefields of Saipan now drowned in bottles of whiskey, making him late, unpredictable, and increasingly difficult to work with. The movie was The Professionals, but what happened behind the scenes was anything but professional. This wasn't just a clash of egos. It was a collision between two men who represented everything the other couldn't stand. And what started as simmering frustration nearly ended with one of them being thrown off a mountain. But to understand why Burt Lancaster truly hated Lee Marvin, we need to go back to where it all began, to the streets of New York and the battlefields of the Pacific, because these two men were forged in fires so different, so intense, that when they finally met, an explosion was inevitable. The story of Burt Lancaster and Lee Marvin isn't just another Hollywood feud. It's a tale of two Americas, two generations of masculinity, two entirely different philosophies about what it meant to be a man in the mid-20th century. Lancaster believed in discipline, control, and the power of refining yourself into something greater. Marvin believed that authenticity meant showing your scars, your weaknesses, your raw humanity, even if it meant falling apart on camera. Both men were right in their own way, and both were completely incompatible with each other. What happened on the set of The Professionals would become Hollywood legend, whispered about in studio commissaries and makeup trailers for decades. Directors learned to never cast them together again. But the real story, the one that explains why a disciplined acrobat-turned-actor would come to despise a combat veteran with a drinking problem, runs deeper than anyone imagined. It's a story about war, both the kind fought on foreign soil and the kind waged within yourself. It's about the price of perfection and the cost of survival. And most of all, it's about two men who Hollywood turned into icons, but who remained fundamentally, explosively human. So let's dive into their worlds, starting with the man who learned to fly through the air before he ever learned to act. Born Burton Stephen Lancaster on November 2, 1913, in the hardscrabble neighborhood of East Harlem, Manhattan, Burt Lancaster entered a world that didn't promise much to the son of a postal worker. The youngest of 5 children born to Irish Protestant immigrants James and Elizabeth Lancaster, young Burt grew up in a cramped apartment where money was tight and opportunities were scarce. But what East Harlem lacked in wealth, it made up for in character. The streets were tough, filled with kids from every ethnic background imaginable, and you learned quickly how to handle yourself, or you didn't last long. For Burt, salvation came not from books or religion, but from an unexpected source, his body. From an early age, Lancaster discovered he had a natural gift for athletics. While other kids played stickball in the streets, young Burt was obsessed with gymnastics. He would spend hours perfecting handstands, backflips, and aerial maneuvers that seemed to defy gravity. His body was a machine that he learned to control with precision, and in that control, he found something powerful, a sense that he could transform himself into something extraordinary. At DeWitt Clinton High School, his athletic prowess became legendary. Teachers and coaches marveled at this lean, muscular teenager who could seemingly do anything physical he set his mind to. But Lancaster wasn't interested in traditional sports. Boxing was too brutal, football too chaotic. What captivated him was the artistry of acrobatics, the way a perfectly executed routine combined strength, grace, timing, and showmanship. When Lancaster was just 19 years old, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He joined the circus. Not as a clown or a roustabout, but as a professional acrobat. Teaming up with his childhood friend Nick Cravat, a diminutive powerhouse with incredible agility, Lancaster formed an act called Lang and Cravat. They joined the K Brothers Circus and began touring the country, performing death-defying aerial routines that left audiences gasping. Night after night, Lancaster would climb high above the crowd, grip a trapeze bar, and launch himself into the void, trusting that his partner would be there to catch him, trusting that his body would execute the triple somersault he'd practiced 10,000 times. There was no room for error. One mistake, one moment of lost concentration, and you could be dead or paralyzed. This was where Burt Lancaster learned discipline, not from a book or a teacher, but from the unforgiving physics of falling through space. The circus life was brutal. You traveled from town to town in cramped train cars, performing 2 shows a day in sweltering tents. eating whatever you could afford, sleeping wherever you could find space. But for Lancaster, it was magical. The circus gave him confidence, taught him showmanship, and most importantly, taught him that if you worked hard enough, if you prepared meticulously enough, if you controlled every variable you possibly could, you could achieve the impossible. This philosophy would follow him for the rest of his life. But circus work was precarious. An injury could end your career instantly, and by his mid-20s, Lancaster had suffered enough bumps and bruises to know he couldn't fly forever. When World War II erupted, he joined the United States Army in January 1943, serving in the 21st Special Services Division, a military unit that entertained troops. After the war, Lancaster found himself in New York, unsure of what came next. He had no formal education beyond high school, no job skills besides acrobatics and entertaining soldiers. But fate intervened in the form of a Broadway play. At age 32, an age when most actors were already established, Lancaster landed a role in A Sound of Hunting in 1945. A Hollywood agent in the audience saw something electric in this tall, athletic newcomer with piercing blue eyes and a smile that could light up a room. Within a year, Lancaster was cast opposite Ava Gardner in The Killers, 1946, a film noir that became a critical and commercial success. Overnight, Burt Lancaster from East Harlem became Burt Lancaster, movie star. But unlike many actors who stumbled into Hollywood and rode their looks to easy paychecks, Lancaster approached acting with the same meticulous discipline he'd brought to the trapeze. He studied every aspect of filmmaking, lighting, camera angles, editing, directing. He wanted control, not because he was a megalomaniac, but because he'd learned that control equaled survival. On the trapeze, if you didn't control every muscle, every breath, every movement, you died. In Hollywood, if you didn't control your image, your roles, your career, the studio system would chew you up and spit you out. So Lancaster became one of the first actors to form his own production company, Hecht Hill Lancaster, giving him unprecedented power over his projects. He could choose his roles, his directors, his co-stars. He could demand script changes and reshoot scenes until they met his exacting standards. This made him incredibly successful, but also incredibly demanding to work with. Lancaster's career trajectory was meteoric. He starred in From Here to Eternity, 1953, delivering a performance opposite Deborah Kerr that included one of cinema's most iconic scenes, that famous beach kiss. The film earned him his first Academy Award nomination. In 1960, he won the Oscar for Best Actor for his barnstorming performance as the charismatic conman preacher in Elmer Gantry, a role that showcased his incredible range. He could play heroes and villains, soldiers and criminals, cynics and idealists. But underneath every character was that same iron discipline, that same control. Lancaster never gave a lazy performance. He prepared for weeks, studied dialects, learned new skills, pushed his body to its limits even as he aged. When he made The Swimmer in 1968, at age 55, he trained intensively because despite being a trained athlete, he was afraid of water and needed to play a man swimming through suburban pools. But Lancaster's perfectionism came with a dark side. He had a hair-trigger temper that could erupt without warning. Directors learned to tread carefully around him. Co-stars who didn't meet his standards faced his withering contempt. He demanded absolute professionalism from everyone on set, from the stars to the grips. And God help you if you showed up late, unprepared, or drunk. Lancaster believed that making movies was serious business, that audiences paid hard-earned money to see quality entertainment, and that everyone involved had a sacred obligation to give their absolute best. To him, acting drunk, showing up intoxicated, or letting personal problems affect your work wasn't just unprofessional. It was a betrayal of everyone who depended on you. This philosophy made him respected, admired, and feared in equal measure. It also made him politically active in ways unusual for Hollywood stars of his era. Lancaster was a vocal progressive who fought against racial discrimination, supported civil rights, and openly opposed the House Un-American Activities Committee's blacklisting witch hunts. In an era when many actors stayed silent to protect their careers, Lancaster used his clout to defend artists who'd been blacklisted. He was named on President Richard Nixon's infamous Enemies List in 1973, a badge of honor to him. The FBI maintained files on Lancaster because of his progressive politics and willingness to speak out. He refused to work with John Wayne, Hollywood's most prominent Republican, because of Wayne's involvement in anti-communist witch hunts. This wasn't the behavior of someone seeking easy popularity. Lancaster had principles, and he stuck to them even when it cost him roles, friendships, and peace of mind. He brought the same uncompromising intensity to his politics that he brought to his acting and his personal relationships. Lancaster married 3 times and had 5 children, though he guarded his personal life fiercely despite his stardom. His first marriage to June Ernst lasted from 1935 to 1946 and produced 5 children. His second marriage to Norma Anderson lasted from 1946 to 1969. His third marriage to Susan Martin lasted from 1990 until his death. Those who knew him described a complex man, generous and loyal to friends, fiercely protective of his family, but also volatile, demanding, and sometimes cruel to those who disappointed him. He could be warm and charming one moment, then turn ice-cold the next if you crossed him. This mercurial temperament meant that working with Burt Lancaster was always intense. You were either all in, meeting his standards and earning his respect, or you were dead to him. There was no middle ground. As Lancaster aged, he continued choosing challenging, unconventional roles. In 1980, at age 67, he delivered one of his finest performances in Atlantic City, playing a small-time criminal dreaming of past glories. The role earned him his 4th Academy Award nomination. Even after suffering a stroke in 1990 that left him partially paralyzed, Lancaster continued working, appearing in Field of Dreams, 1995, in his final role. He died on October 20, 1994, at age 80, leaving behind a legacy of over 70 films and a reputation as one of Hollywood's most talented, complicated, and principled actors. Burt Lancaster had transformed himself from a poor kid from East Harlem into a Hollywood icon through sheer discipline, talent, and force of will. He'd proven that if you controlled yourself, controlled your craft, and never compromised your standards, you could achieve greatness. But this philosophy would put him on a collision course with a man who represented everything he couldn't stand. A man who wore his demons on his sleeve and drank to forget the horrors he'd seen in war. Lamont Waltman Marvin Jr. was born on February 19, 1924, in New York City to a very different kind of family than Burt Lancaster's working-class Irish immigrants. Lee Marvin's father, Lamont Marvin Sr., was a successful advertising executive, and his mother, Courtney Washington Davidge, came from a prominent family with connections to American history. On paper, young Lee had every advantage: money, education, social standing. But from the beginning, he was a rebel who couldn't or wouldn't fit into the comfortable upper-middle-class world his parents inhabited. Raised in a working-class yet aspiring household, Marvin grew up hunting and fishing, developing an early love for the outdoors that stood in stark contrast to the buttoned-up business world his father navigated. As a teenager, Marvin was expelled from several schools for fighting, drinking, and general troublemaking. He wasn't stupid. He was smart, charismatic, and naturally athletic. But he had zero interest in conforming to society's expectations. While Burt Lancaster was perfecting his trapeze routine with obsessive discipline, teenage Lee Marvin was picking fights in bars and deliberately getting kicked out of schools. His parents didn't know what to do with him. After leaving school at age 18, directionless and rebellious, Marvin made a decision that would change his life forever. He enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in August 1942, right in the middle of World War II. He wasn't running toward glory or patriotism. He was running away from a life that felt suffocating. What he found instead was carnage. Marvin served in the 4th Marine Division as a scout sniper in the Pacific Theater, one of the most brutal combat zones in human history. He saw action in Kwajalein, Inuiatok, and Saipan, names that don't mean much to modern Americans, but that meant everything to the young men who fought there. On June 18, 1944, during the Battle of Saipan, Private First Class Lee Marvin was part of an assault on Mount Tapasho. His company was ordered to take the heavily fortified position despite facing overwhelming Japanese resistance. What happened next would haunt Marvin for the rest of his life. As his unit advanced, Japanese machine gun fire tore through them. Most of his company was killed almost instantly. Marvin was hit by machine gun fire that severed his sciatic nerve, a catastrophic injury that should have killed him. As he lay bleeding on the ground, paralyzed from the waist down, a Japanese sniper shot him in the foot. He survived only because Navy corpsmen dragged him to safety under heavy fire. The physical wounds eventually healed, though Marvin walked with a permanent limp for the rest of his life. But the psychological wounds never healed. Marvin suffered from what we now recognize as severe PTSD, nightmares, flashbacks, survivor's guilt, and crushing anxiety. He'd watched his friends die, held dying men in his arms, killed enemy soldiers in close combat, and been left for dead himself. That kind of trauma doesn't just go away. Marvin received a Purple Heart and a medical discharge, but he came home to an America that had no idea how to help traumatized combat veterans. In the 1940s and 1950s, PTSD wasn't recognized or treated. You were just expected to get over it and move on with your life. So Marvin did what countless veterans have done. He self-medicated with alcohol. Drinking became his way of numbing the memories, silencing the nightmares, and getting through each day. It would become both his crutch and his curse. After the war, Marvin had no idea what to do with himself. A chance encounter led him to try acting, initially just as a way to make money. He studied at the American Theater Wing in New York, appearing in small stage productions. Unlike Lancaster, who approached acting with circus performer discipline, Marvin approached it with combat veteran authenticity. He didn't need to act tough, he was tough. He didn't need to pretend he'd seen death, he'd lived through it. This raw, dangerous quality caught Hollywood's attention. Throughout the 1950s, Marvin became one of Hollywood's most reliable villains and character actors. He played thugs, killers, and bad guys in dozens of films and TV shows, often stealing scenes from the stars. He worked with John Wayne in The Comancheros, 1961, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, 1962, and Donovan's Reef, 1963. His bass voice, craggy face, and genuine menace made him unforgettable. But Marvin remained a supporting player, always in someone else's shadow, until 1965 when everything changed. That year, he starred in Cat Ballou, a comedy western where he played dual roles as both Kid Shalene, a washed-up drunk gunfighter, and Tim Strawn, a ruthless killer. Marvin's performance was revelatory, funny, vulnerable, dangerous, and heartbreaking all at once. For playing Kid Shalene, a role that in many ways mirrored his own struggles with alcohol, Lee Marvin won the Academy Award for Best Actor. At age 41, after years of being Hollywood's go-to villain, he was suddenly a leading man. And unlike Burt Lancaster, who'd used his newfound stardom to exercise iron control over his career, Marvin used his fame to work on interesting projects with great directors while continuing to drink heavily. The same year he won his Oscar, Marvin starred in The Professionals, 1966, alongside Burt Lancaster. The film was a western about 4 soldiers of fortune hired to rescue a kidnapped woman in revolutionary Mexico. On paper, it should have been a perfect match, 2 of Hollywood's most masculine stars in an action-packed adventure. In reality, it was a disaster. Lancaster arrived on set in peak physical condition despite being 53 years old, having trained for months to do his own stunts. He knew his lines cold, showed up early, stayed late, and expected everyone else to match his professionalism. Marvin, by contrast, was in the grip of his alcoholism. He would show up late, sometimes drunk, often unprepared. His drinking had reached the point where it was bottoming out his ability to function, and the desert heat made everything worse. Lancaster, who'd spent his life perfecting control and discipline, was forced to work with someone who embodied chaos and self-destruction. According to director Richard Brooks and crew members, Lancaster's frustration built day by day. He would wait in full costume in the scorching desert while Marvin slept off a hangover. Scenes had to be res-hot because Marvin flubbed lines he was too drunk to remember. The breaking point came when Marvin, inebriated and arguing about props, destroyed a historically accurate weapon Lancaster had researched extensively. Lancaster, a physically powerful man with a notorious temper, reportedly grabbed Marvin and threatened to throw him off a mountain if he didn't get his act together. Crew members had to separate them. Brooks, the director, later said he was genuinely afraid Lancaster might hurt Marvin. From that point on, Lancaster and Marvin were barely speaking. The tension was so thick that other actors, Robert Ryan and Woody Strode, tried to stay out of their way. Marvin's drinking continued through the shoot, and Lancaster's contempt grew deeper with each passing day. Despite the behind-the-scenes chaos, The Professionals was a huge commercial and critical success. Audiences loved the action, the scenery, and the chemistry between the 4 leads. Ironically, the tension between Lancaster and Marvin translated into compelling screen dynamics. But Hollywood insiders knew the truth. Word spread that Lancaster had sworn never to work with Marvin again, and that Marvin, for his part, found Lancaster's perfectionism suffocating and self-righteous. They represented two fundamentally incompatible approaches to both acting and life. Lancaster believed discipline could overcome any obstacle. Marvin believed authenticity meant accepting your flaws, even if they destroyed you. After The Professionals, Marvin's career continued its upward trajectory. He starred in The Dirty Dozen, 1967, Point Blank, 1967, Hell in the Pacific, 1968, Paint Your Wagon, 1969, and The Big Red One, 1980. He continued drinking heavily throughout, though he managed to maintain enough functionality to work steadily. In 1979, Marvin became involved in a landmark legal case when his former lover Michelle Triola sued him for palimony, claiming she was entitled to financial support after their 6-year relationship ended. The case created the legal concept of palimony and was widely publicized. Though Marvin ultimately won, the trial exposed his personal life and struggles to public scrutiny. Lee Marvin continued working until the end. On August 29, 1987, at age 63, he died from a heart attack in Tucson, Arizona, where he'd been preparing for another film role. Unlike Lancaster, who'd lived to 80 through discipline and control, Marvin burned fast and died relatively young, his body worn down by decades of alcohol abuse and the lingering effects of his combat wounds. But in his 63 years, Lee Marvin had lived several lifetimes. Combat hero, Oscar winner, Hollywood rebel, and a man who never pretended to be anything other than what he was: broken, authentic, and unforgettable. He left behind a legacy of performances that felt dangerously real because, in many ways, they were. Where Lancaster transformed himself through control, Marvin revealed himself through chaos. So why did Burt Lancaster truly hate Lee Marvin? The surface answer, that Marvin's alcoholism disrupted Lancaster's work, is only part of the story. The deeper truth is that each man represented everything the other had spent his life rejecting. Lancaster had pulled himself up from poverty through superhuman discipline. He'd turned his body into a precision instrument, approached acting like engineering, and believed that willpower could overcome any weakness. To him, Marvin's drinking wasn't just unprofessional, it was a moral failure. Here was a man with every advantage Lancaster never had: financial security, education, opportunities, squandering it all because he lacked self-control. Lancaster, who'd literally risked his life on the trapeze night after night through sheer discipline, couldn't fathom how someone could throw away their talent, their career, their life, just because they were haunted by their past. But Marvin saw Lancaster differently. To Marvin, Lancaster's perfectionism wasn't admirable, it was inhuman. Marvin had fought in one of the bloodiest campaigns of World War II. He'd killed men and watched his friends die. He carried that trauma every day, and alcohol was the only thing that made it bearable. Lancaster's insistence on control, on perfection, on never showing weakness, struck Marvin as the behavior of someone who'd never faced real darkness. In combat, control is an illusion. You can train perfectly, prepare meticulously, and still die because a bullet hits you instead of the guy next to you. Marvin's drinking was self-destructive, but it was also authentic, a genuine response to genuine trauma. Lancaster's discipline, from Marvin's perspective, was a fantasy, a refusal to acknowledge that some things can't be controlled. This fundamental philosophical divide extended beyond their personal interaction. Lancaster represented the old Hollywood ideal: stars as aspirational figures who transcended their circumstances through discipline and hard work. Marvin represented the new Hollywood that was emerging, actors as flawed, complicated human beings whose authenticity came from their damage, not from their perfection. Lancaster made movies that affirmed traditional values: honor, discipline, transformation. Marvin made movies that questioned those values, showing men broken by violence, corrupted by systems, or simply surviving as best they could. Both approaches had merit. Both produced great art. But they were fundamentally incompatible on a human level. The tragedy is that Lancaster and Marvin had more in common than either could admit. Both were self-made men who'd come from nothing, or in Marvin's case, had thrown away privilege to become Hollywood legends. Both were intensely physical actors who did their own stunts and brought athleticism to their roles. Both chose unconventional projects and worked with great directors. Both were politically liberal, Lancaster opposing the blacklist, Marvin supporting civil rights. Both were complicated, difficult men whose personal demons sometimes overwhelmed their professional achievements. In another universe, they might have been friends, recognizing their shared struggles. But in this universe, their differences were insurmountable. After The Professionals, Lancaster and Marvin never worked together again. Lancaster continued his disciplined approach, delivering acclaimed performances well into his 70s. Marvin continued drinking and working, burning bright and fast until his heart gave out at 63. When Marvin died in 1987, Lancaster was asked about him by reporters. His response was diplomatic but distant. He acknowledged Marvin's talent, but said nothing about liking him as a person. When Lancaster died 7 years later in 1994, few obituaries mentioned his feud with Marvin. By then, both men had been canonized as old Hollywood legends, their conflicts reduced to amusing anecdotes rather than the serious philosophical divide they represented. But for those who were there, who watched these two titans nearly come to blows in the desert heat, the memory remained vivid. It was more than a personality conflict or a professional disagreement. It was a collision between two ways of being a man, two ways of surviving trauma, two ways of approaching art and life. Lancaster believed salvation came through discipline, that you could master yourself and thereby master your fate. Marvin believed authenticity meant accepting that you couldn't master anything, that trauma doesn't heal just because you want it to, and that sometimes the best you can do is survive another day, even if that day includes a bottle. Both men were right. Both men were tragic. And neither could see past his own philosophy long enough to recognize the pain in the other. Today, both Burt Lancaster and Lee Marvin are remembered as giants of mid-century American cinema. Film scholars study Lancaster's performances for their technical brilliance and emotional range. They study Marvin's performances for their raw authenticity and dangerous unpredictability. Modern actors cite both as influences. Lancaster for teaching them discipline and craft, Marvin for teaching them that vulnerability and damage can be sources of strength. The cinema has room for both approaches, even if the men themselves couldn't coexist. Lancaster's legacy includes over 70 films, an Academy Award for nominations, and a body of work that showcases incredible versatility, from noir antiheroes to romantic leads to aging criminals to father figures. He proved that an actor could be intelligent, political, athletic, and emotionally complex all at once. His insistence on control pioneered the modern era of actor-producers who shaped their own careers. His political activism showed that Hollywood stars could use their platforms for more than self-promotion. His perfectionism raised the bar for what audiences could expect from movie stars. Every actor who takes their craft seriously, who trains intensively for roles, who demands script quality and director respect, walks in Lancaster's footsteps. Marvin's legacy is equally profound but different. His approximately 50 films showcase a different kind of range, the range of human damage and resilience. He showed that authenticity didn't require prettiness, that leading men could be scarred and broken and still compelling. His Oscar win for Cat Ballou opened doors for character actors to become stars. His performances in Point Blank and The Big Red One influenced generations of directors and actors interested in depicting violence and trauma honestly. His willingness to play antiheroes and criminals without glamorizing them predated the antiheroes of modern television by decades. Every actor who brings their real pain to their performances, who refuses to hide their scars, who finds strength in vulnerability, walks in Marvin's footsteps. The irony is that contemporary cinema has synthesized these approaches. Modern actors are expected to be both disciplined, Lancaster's gift, and emotionally vulnerable, Marvin's gift. Method acting, physical transformation, and authentic emotion are all valued. The old dichotomy between technical perfection and raw authenticity has collapsed. Today's greatest actors, Daniel Day-Lewis, Joaquin Phoenix, Christian Bale, combine Lancaster's meticulous preparation with Marvin's willingness to expose their darkness. The film industry learned what Lancaster and Marvin couldn't, that discipline and authenticity aren't opposites but complementary tools. You need both to create truly transcendent art. But in 1966, on the set of The Professionals, in the scorching desert heat of the American Southwest, two men who'd each found their own path to greatness couldn't bridge the divide between them. Burt Lancaster looked at Lee Marvin and saw a waste of talent, a man destroying himself through lack of discipline. Lee Marvin looked at Burt Lancaster and saw a control freak in denial about the chaos of existence. Both were partially right. Both were stubbornly blind. And the hatred that grew between them wasn't really about professionalism or drinking or punctuality. It was about two incompatible philosophies of survival, two ways of processing trauma. Lancaster's through control, Marvin's through acceptance, that could never coexist in the same space. In the end, we remember them both. We watch From Here to Eternity and marvel at Lancaster's beach scene perfection. We watch Point Blank and feel Marvin's rage and pain radiating off the screen. We're grateful they both existed, even as we acknowledge they could never have been friends. Their conflict reminds us that great art comes from people, and people are complicated, contradictory, and sometimes incompatible. The desert heat of 1966 may have cooled, and both men are now decades gone, but their work remains. And their feud, far from diminishing their legacies, actually illuminates what made each of them unique. Burt Lancaster hated Lee Marvin because Marvin represented chaos Lancaster had spent his life conquering. Lee Marvin resented Burt Lancaster because Lancaster represented a denial of the darkness Marvin knew was inescapable. Neither could win that argument because they were arguing about different things. And Hollywood, that dream factory built on contradictions, had room for both their truths, even if they themselves didn't.